I have a feeling that I'm going to ultimately just be tying together a lot of themes that have been percolating over the course of the last day. But I wanted to just start with a line. There's a line of poetry that I think about almost every day. And it comes from Mary Oliver, who passed away last month, who was, of course, one of the few poets people who just stumble into Barnes & Noble or click on Amazon happen to buy. And her great theme, of course, was how we needed to pay greater attention to the world, which she did through taking long walks on Cape Cod and staring at leaves and looking at foxes. And she wrote a line that, as I said, just sticks with me, which is that attention is the beginning of devotion. Attention is the beginning of devotion. That when I think about Facebook, and I think about when I think about the Google world that we've stumbled into, we have such a hard time truly registering the damage that they have done to us. And I think that the greatest violence that they've done to us as individuals is that they make it hard for us to be devoted. Attention is the beginning of devotion. In order to be a spiritual person, in order to be a truly loving person, you need to be able to pause and pay attention. And I'll get to the political and economic problems of the platform monopolies, but I think that we always need to return to the core question of attention. That the reason that they amass so much data is that they are composing this cartography of our mind, that they've figured out how to map our psyche. That data is such a bloodless word, but data is a dossier that helps to unlock us. So data is more than just the things that you willingly submit to these companies, of course. It is everything that you've read on the internet. It is every question that you begin to enter into Google. When you begin to compose a post on Facebook and delete it, that too is saved by their pack rat servers, that the cost of computing is so cheap, they're able to amass everything, whether it's important to them in the short term or not. They don't know what's important, so they keep everything. And the algorithms troll in order to find the hidden patterns in the way that you think. And the result is that they've been able to probe you in order to find the things that cause you pleasure, to find the things that cause you anxiety. And that data, that portrait of the inside of your head, is in turn used in order to manipulate you, in order to commandeer as much of your attention as possible. And so this is the world that we live in, and it's a world in which, and that is the basis for the power of Facebook and Google. And part of the power is its invisibility. That if the polling that's been done of Facebook users shows pretty clearly that even in spite of the Facebook scandals, in spite of everything that has been exposed in the New York Times or on TV about Facebook, people are still largely unaware of the existence of the algorithm and the fact that the news and information that they're consuming has been given a sense of hierarchy. It's not just friends showing friends articles or pictures. That there's a sense of hierarchy that's been imposed on the news and information that we consume via the platforms, and that information has been arrayed in such a way to keep us engaged for as long as possible, to occupy as much of our attention as possible. Now, I consider this to be a public health problem because I know this myself. I mean, even though I wrote a book trashing these companies, and even though I'm fully aware of all the perils that they pose, I wouldn't be honest with you if I didn't admit that I'm engaged in a deep struggle with my own relationship to technology. That if I wanted to get a good night's sleep, I have to stick my phone in the basement, because otherwise I know that there'll be a moment in the middle of the night where I reach for my phone and I get trapped in a zombie scroll. And you wake up the next morning and you know that your rhythms have been completely knocked off and you have zero recollection of the thing it is that you looked at in the middle of the night. And so when I talk to people at the companies, I use the word addiction, which they'll respond, whoa, don't go there. That's a scientific term. What we produce, yes, it's designed to get people engaged for as long as possible, but I really do think that we need to think of it as a form of addiction. And so if I were to distill the peril that is posed by these companies, it's something that begins at the level of the individual, and then we can see how it's replicated at other levels, which is this relationship that is totally unhealthy, where we're either, you could call it addicted or dependent. And the dependency that we each feel on our phones is something that's replicated in larger parts of the economy. That these companies are now engaged in an arms race to become our personal assistant. And that's the reason why they're all trying to implant those little speakers in the corner of your bedroom or your kitchen or wherever, and so that you'll be engaged in a never-ending conversation with their machine. And you'll ask the machine questions, and the machine will supply answers. And the dream of Silicon Valley is frictionlessness, that you need to be, you should be relieved of the burden of making unnecessary decisions or unnecessary choices. Information and things should be delivered to you in the most seamless, effortless sort of way so that you can focus on whatever else. And as a result, that gives them even more power, because at least when you're looking at a Google search, everybody clicks on the thing that appears first or second. Nobody makes it to page 2, but at least there's a menu of options. But as we become more merged with these machines, and as we interact with them in ways that are different from conventional reading, the less choices we're ultimately going to have. And it'll just see whatever Google, what's the news today? Whatever Google spits out, it's not going to be look at option A, B, and C. It's going to be whatever option A that they've provided to you is. And the dream ultimately is this human dream. Technology is one of the things that defines us as a species, our ability to affect our environment. We've always been merging with machines. The hammer is an extension of the arm. The factory is the automation of upper body strength. But these are intellectual machines. And when we merge with these machines, of course, we're not just merging with a tool, we're merging with the companies that operate them. And so they've amassed incredible power over our public square, as we've been talking about, over our economy, and also, I think, over the future of our species. And one of the things that's so startling, when I was researching my book, I spent a lot of time on YouTube. And watching the founders of these companies speak. And as you listen to them, you realize the ways in which the technology press doesn't always serve us well, because when Larry Page or Mark Zuckerberg speaks, they don't just speak about the latest app or the latest camera resolution that they're unveiling. They often say quite important and profound things about human nature, about the ways that we organize ourselves. And I think that they have a very strong view of human nature. And if you look at it on the surface, we've spent a lot of time assuming that the titans of Silicon Valley were libertarians, because of course they don't want to be regulated. And a lot of them read Ayn Rand at some point, and maybe that was the last book that they ever read. And so they spent a lot of time talking about it. But if you listen really hard to what they're saying, it's something that's quite different than a Randian view of individualism. That ultimately, the way that they think about the world is a collectivist one in its outlook. That's why media is social, why it's a hive mind, why everything should be crowdsourced. And there's this kind of fetishization, ultimately, of the collective. And I think it helps explain part of the reason why these companies have been so insensitive to individualism and individuality, why they're so willing to roll privacy, why they have such a dismissive attitude towards authorship. Part of the reason why they're so happy to have their algorithms displace free will in any way, shape, or form. And it's part of the reason why they ultimately view monopoly as the platonic state of capitalism. The world is a network, and the network needs to be captured. And if the network is captured by one firm, well, that's just the natural way of the world, and it's the system that will deliver, in the end, the most efficiency. And we see this in journalism, where Facebook and Google have come. At first, they were perceived as friends. They were a means of breaking down an old elitist world where you had these fuddy-duddy gatekeepers sitting at the New York Times and the Washington Post who didn't pay sufficient heed to the people out there. And it seemed like it was a means of both liberation, and then it was also a means to reach this much, much larger audience, because if you publish something and it got linked to in Google or Facebook, it was suddenly accessible to a much, much wider world. And it was greeted at first, as I said, as a friend. But we've seen now that just like I am unhealthily dependent on my cell phone, media and the world achieved a similar sense of unhealthy dependence on the platforms. So I'll just give you a small anecdote. As Eric said, I was the editor of The New Republic, which was this little magazine that always had a small audience. I think that there was a point where in History of the 1960s, I read the author said that the total circulation of the New Republic could have never filled half of the University of Mississippi football stadium. It was a small magazine that was self-consciously elitist and never had a terribly large audience. But then we had a particularly bracing contact with Facebook, because the magazine was bought by Mark Zuckerberg's roommate from college, who happened to be Facebook employee number 3. And we started off, when he bought the magazine, having really noble intentions about having a benefactor, an enlightened benefactor, who wanted to help the magazine navigate its way into the new digital era with dignity. And it all started off great, but then there became this inevitable moment where he said, you know what, the stations of magazine ownership. The first station is you come in and you express your noble intentions, and then the second station is you begin to panic about all the money that you spent at the first station, and then the third station is you start to overreact. And so he said, you know what, I know exactly how we can make money quickly, which is by producing things that get traffic on social media. And so we installed a Facebook guru on our staff. And in a very compressed period of time, we experienced something that the rest of media experience, which is that you begin to think about producing, how can I master the platform? How can I produce the things that will go viral on the platform? Because the platform suddenly offers me this opportunity to reach this much broader world that I would have never been able to get through print. But then you start to realize that you're not mastering the platform is actually mastering you, because the values of the platform end up implanting themselves in your brain. You begin to play by the rules that the platform has set. And I'll give you, there's a small example of this. There was a lion a couple years ago who was like the Kim Kardashian of lions, called Cecil, an endangered species, who was killed by a hunter who was a dentist from Minnesota, who posted a picture of Cecil on Facebook. Everybody, quite rightly, is roused into a fit of anger over the murder of Cecil. And the key word in our era is trending. Everybody wants to tap into the thing that is at the trailhead of its ascent to popularity. And we all see this in our offices, in our media offices, because we have access to all this data now ourselves. Every journalist has something called Chartbeat, which is this meter that shows how popular something is at any given moment. If you walk into the newsroom of the Washington Post, there are these massive television screens hovering over the newsroom, showing what's popular at any given moment. And that's a statement of values. That management is telling its journalist, you want to be up there at the top of that screen. And so Cecil gets killed. You start to see these pockets of outrage on the internet, and you say, I want some of that traffic too. And so every news organization begins to converge on the same subject. And in the end, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, I'm sure Us Weekly, BuzzFeed, whatever, everybody converges on Cecil the lion. And in the end, there are 3.2 million stories that are written about the sad death of Cecil the lion. And I think it shows a couple things. In part, one of the promises of the platforms, of Facebook, of Google, was that we would arrive into this golden age of personalization, that it was a place where we would all find our niche, and our niche would be served. But really, the rise of the platforms have allowed us some of that, but they've also contributed to a new age of conformism. It's very hard to see sometimes, but it's happened. And it's also see the way that that media begins to think so much more about audience, and that it creates these feedback loops. One of the most, I think, important terms of our age is the filter bubble concept, that we exist in a world where our biases are constantly being confirmed. And that too is its own form of conformism, that once you get sorted into your filter bubble, into your community, you're being served the information that you want to hear. And we've seen the ways in which that's incredibly dangerous, because when your bias is constantly being confirmed, you're in the process of being intellectually weakened. You become susceptible to fake news, propaganda, demagoguery. I would argue that in a way our current president is the political version of Cecil the lion. That when Trump came onto the scene, I think that a lot of media, liberal media, had its own reasons for paying attention to Donald Trump. That when he talked about Barack Obama's birth certificate, that anger that generated was something that liberal media like to tap into as well. because they saw the ways in which it would give us traffic. Eric, how much time am I doing all right?
Yeah, you got 5 to 10 minutes.
All right. And so the question is, I think ultimately, so BuzzFeed, I think we've seen what's happened to BuzzFeed, which is the classic example of a media organization that set out to master the platform, but then became mastered by it. Jonah Peretti, who founded BuzzFeed, was a graduate student at the MIT Media Lab. And his PhD dissertation was about the concept of virality. And he conducted an experiment when he was a graduate student that tried to make the concept of Nike sweatshop labor into something that would travel virally. And he started to try to figure out the ways in which content could be produced to explode over Facebook. And he built a massive media organization that was suddenly talked about in the same breath as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian. And it was all premised on its relationship to Facebook, that it was producing. Didn't matter if you went to BuzzFeed.com to get the news, or if you accessed it on Pinterest or Instagram or Facebook. It was all about creating pieces of content that tapped into people's emotions and therefore traveled across these social networks. And it became phenomenally successful, and it attracted investment from all the big players in the industry. But in the end, that dependence on Facebook made BuzzFeed enormously vulnerable, because all it took was Facebook changing its business strategy, changing its algorithms, and they were hosed. And that's what happened at the beginning of last year. Facebook decided that it was because of the Cambridge Analytica scandals and because of the Russia scandals, Facebook said that the news business was leaving it too vulnerable, and that it was recommitting to its core mission, which was connecting individuals. And so a BuzzFeed article was suddenly less privileged by the Facebook algorithm, and the picture you were sharing of your cat got boosted. And then it had the perverse effect of destroying the news organizations that were most catered to Facebook. And as a result, Facebook had to lay off last week, I think it was 15% of its staff. It had to shut down whole bureaus that it had opened up. And so what's the response to this dependent situation that we've created? Of course, there are personal responses. I think that there's kind of the Mary Oliver response, which is to disconnect yourself from the machine in order to create circumstances where you're able to reclaim ownership of your attention. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the policy responses. But we have traditions in this country within our political economy that should equip us to respond to these monopolies. That if you look at the history of the United States, we've always been very, very concerned about concentrations of power in the communications space. That the post office was the first communications monopoly, but we didn't let it extend into the telegraph business. And then when Western Union achieved a monopoly in the telegram business, we didn't let it, Ulysses S. Grant threatened to nationalize it, and they were so worried about the government taking strong and decisive action against it that they were afraid to get into the telephone business. And then when AT&T was in the telephone business, they created this essentially deal with the government where they kept their monopoly in a regulated sort of way, but they were also afraid of getting into the radio business. And then NBC got divided into NBC and ABC when NBC was too powerful as a radio station. And then the Nixon administration opened up space to create the cable news industry. And the last major example of this, of course, is I think one of the most underrated moments in recent American political economy, which was the Microsoft case, where the government said to Microsoft, we don't like the abusive way that you've used your power with the browser and the desktop, and we're going to stop you. And in the shadow of 9/11, the Bush administration stayed its hand and didn't go as far as perhaps it could have into ultimately breaking up Microsoft. But what happened is you had countervailing powers in effect that Microsoft for a decade was scared. And if you talk to people at Google, they'll say that Microsoft could have strangled us in our crib, but they didn't. So antitrust and this great tradition of anti-monopoly thinking and legislation and that impulse has actually been an incredibly important engine of innovation, of creating space for challengers to walk in and take on the incumbents who seem so entrenched. And when you listen to people today, you just get the sense, so this backlash has emerged against Facebook and Google, and it's come really, really suddenly. And I think it's taken the companies by surprise, and Facebook especially has done a pretty terrible job of managing its public image. It was underinvested, they probably would admit that they would have been underinvested in lobbying and the resources that would allow them to engage. But that's because the backlash came so suddenly. But even still, even with the ferocity of the backlash that's come on the heels of the Russia scandals and the Cambridge Analytica scandals, it's still so hard for us to imagine, I think, government taking meaningful action against these companies. I mean, there's the example in Europe now that we can look towards, but even that feels, I think, fairly distant from where we're sitting right now. And so, Eric was, I think, making fun of me for being incredibly bleak before we got up here. And I am fairly bleak when it comes to the possibility of government taking action in the next couple of years. But the thing that does give me the greatest deal of encouragement, and I'll end it here, I think is that alongside the political track and alongside the fact that you will have Democratic presidential candidates talking about economic concentration probably for the first time in several generations in this campaign. Elizabeth Warren, I think, has been especially vocal on the question. It's something that she's spent a whole lot of time thinking about. I do think that there's the possibility of an individual backlash happening as well. Facebook's profits are still ginormous and not slowing down, but I do think that we're at a moment where we're starting to pause as individuals to think again about this. The example that I use in the book that I find most inspiring is our relationship to the book. That when Amazon debuted the Kindle at $9.99 per book, it seemed like this irresistible thing. Here was every volume in human history suddenly accessible for less, and you could download it in a heartbeat. And Nicholas Negroponte, who is the head of the MIT Media Lab, said, by the year 2015, paper books will disappear. And lo and behold, we made this collective decision, I think it was largely subconscious, to resist the thing that was most convenient, to resist the thing that was cheaper, because we made a decision that we wanted to inhabit spaces where we're not constantly being notified, where our attention is not always being hijacked, where you're not umbilically connected to a corporate store, where there was this place where your attention really could be the beginning point of devotion. Thank you.
All right, so while we get this technological marvel going, I just have one comment that Frank reminded me of when he was talking about his experiences at the New Republic. I used to write for one of the country's major news weeklies on a regular basis about pretty much the kinds of subjects we've been talking about for the last 24 hours. And at one point they told me that my metrics would go up and I would get better placement if I could find a way to mention Britney Spears more often. I'm not making that up. All right, we have a technological marvel here. Yes, and there's it. See, Jamie Suskind, joining us live from London, is the author of Future Politics. And Jamie, can you hear us? You can hear me through the phone, I guess.
I can hear you.
Okay, great, and we can hear you, so go ahead.
Right, well, first of all, sorry, I'm getting some horrendous feedback here, unless someone is beeping aggressively at me.
I think the way to do it is that. No. Where's your volume? Oh, that's the volume.
I guess, Eric, you could switch off the phone link while I'm speaking.
Yeah, okay, let's do that then.
Oh, that's much better. Well, good afternoon, folks from London. Thank you for having me. I can see an exasperated look, you no longer hear me.
Now it's okay? Okay, great. Go ahead. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Shall I carry on?
Carry on. Keep calm and carry on.
Well, folks, it's a pleasure to be, I guess, with you. All I can see just now really is a picture, a portrait of Dag Hammarskjöld. Great room. Actually, I can't hear what's going on either, so if I make a joke, it will be greeted with the usual deafening silence. There, I guess. As Eric mentioned, I'm the author of a book called Future Politics, and the challenge, I guess, that I would want to bring to today's meeting is to recognize that what Franklin very eloquently and correctly described as a public health problem is actually really the start of something much deeper and much bigger, a change in human civilization that could be as profound for us as the difference between a civilization that had the invention of writing and a civilization that preceded it, which did not. And there's a story told, or rather Henry Ford used to say, that when he asked people what they wanted in life, or for their transit, they tell them that they wanted faster horses. And of course he was the guy who brought the automobile to the mass market. And I sometimes worry, or sometimes think, that our political thinking is faster horses thinking. We tend to imagine the future in terms of today as a sort of faster and sleeker, more chrome-like version of what we have now, whereas in fact it could be something entirely different. And chasing down that suspicion in my book, I wanted to focus on the four most important and fundamental words and concepts that we use to speak about politics: power, freedom, democracy, and justice. And I look at each of those and I ask what they meant in the past and what they mean today, and what they might mean in the future in a world transformed by digital technology. By which I mean increasingly capable systems, computing systems that can do things which we would in the past have considered unimaginable. Increasingly integrated technology, the idea that rather than interfacing with tech through the keyboard and the mouse and the screen, or the so-called glass slabs that we hold in our hands, in the future tech will surround us in our objects and appliances and artifacts and utilities. And the idea of an increasingly quantified society. We generate more data now every 2 hours than we did from the dawn of time until 2003. And I look at those trends together and I see that what we could be going through is something much bigger, in fact, than a public health crisis or even a public policy crisis, but rather a fundamental change in the way we live. So just cycling through those concepts very quickly, and I am trying to summarize years of work in 10 minutes, no doubt unsuccessfully. But I think that power, first of all, beginning with power, digital technology is going to change what that word means in our time. If you take a basic definition of power as getting people do, then technology actually can be used as a form of power over us in three different ways. One is by writing rules that the rest of us have to follow. So when you take your first drive in a self-driving car and it refuses to drive over the speed limit or park illegally just for a moment, you are subject to the rules that someone else has written. Those rules may be laws, they may reflect laws, but they may be a different kind of rule, a different kind of law embedded in code. And that's been recognized as a feature of cyberspace for some time. With the Internet of Things, it'll be a feature of real space as well. The second way that technology is a form of power, or can be a form of power, is because of the data that it gathers about us. The more that you know about someone, the easier it is to influence and even manipulate them. That, as Franklin has indicated, is the basis of almost all online advertising, and increasingly a lot of political advertising too. But of course, having data gathered about us plays a disciplinary function as well, because we behave differently when we know that we are being watched. Or rather, one of my predictions is that in the future we will behave differently when we know that we're being watched. Right now, you're more likely to be caught out by technologies. Like the guy who went to prison for the murder of his wife. His defense failed because he said that she had been tied down in the course of a burglary, a home invasion, and killed. But the Fitbit that she was wearing told a very different story, that she'd in fact been running around the house, and her heart rate was consistent with someone who was fleeing. And that alone, but that was part of the evidentiary basis in which he was eventually convicted. So I think once we come round to the fact that increasing amounts of our lives are documented in court and stored in permanent or semi-permanent form, it would be strange if it didn't change human behavior in some way. And of course, the third way that technology is a form of power is that it controls our perception of the world. All of us rely on third parties to present us with news and information about the universe beyond our immediate perception. And increasingly, we turn to technologies, whether it's our news, which we get through algorithmic means, whether it's our search. Oh, there's some consternation here. Can you still hear me? Yes? Should carry on?
Yes.
Okay. Whether it's our news or our search, and even when we communicate with each other, we perhaps take it for granted in the West, but if you use WeChat, oh goodness, there's loads of you. Hi there. You all look very friendly. The technologies that control the way that we communicate with each other are important as well, because we perhaps take it for granted in the West that the equivalent of WhatsApp in China, if I send a message to you saying Amnesty International, that message will never arrive, and neither of us will know. So I look at those three factors: the ability to write rules that the rest of us have to follow, like the self-driving car example, the ability to gather enormous amounts of data about us, and the ability to control our perception of the world. And I see this as a new and strange form of power in human affairs, one which doesn't correspond to many people's typical conceptions of power as relating to parliaments and legislatures and congresses and the like, and which largely resides, just now at least, in the private sector. Now, I ask what this means for freedom, and I talk in my book about the idea of privatization of freedom, the idea that key things like freedom of speech, including important speech like political speech, increasingly we rely on private sector, third parties to uphold our rights to free speech by allowing us to communicate in the manner that they do on their online platforms. But I would also say that there's a question about how much freedom there's going to be in the future caused by digital technology. 78% of British people confess to have done one of the following things. They've paid someone cash in hand without, while knowing that tax wouldn't be paid on that money. They've dodged a bus fare by jumping on the bus and jumping off again without paying the fee. They've illegally streamed something online, and they've taken more than their fair share at the soda dispenser in a restaurant. If you imagine, and these are all crimes. I sometimes call them mini crimes, but they are actually just crimes, and 78% of us here in the UK have certainly done them. The reason for that is not because we're scoundrels, but it's because there is a hinterland of liberty that we all take for granted, which means that we're allowed to get away with small things some of the time, so long as we don't abuse the system, which is why all of us might have driven over the speed limit or parked illegally just for a moment. But in the future, I ask whether those And so, to borrow a phrase from Larry Lessig, we live in a society just now where there are a lot of doors that say do not enter, or we can walk through them and be punished later, maybe. But we're moving into a world, I suggest, where there are many more locked doors, where you can't break the rules at all because those rules are coded into the technologies around you. And I think, again, it's quite a profound change in human civilization. I'll come on to democracy at the end. The third factor that I look at in the book is justice. And I look at two types of justice. One is justice in distribution, and one is justice in recognition. Increasingly, so in the past, political theorists and economists assumed or took for granted that stuff was distributed around society by the market and redistributed by the state. But increasingly, we rely on systems, algorithms, to distribute things of importance to us. So, for instance, your access to credit, or your access to a mortgage, or your access to a loan if you're a small business, or to health insurance might be algorithmically determined and are increasingly so. Your access to a job, the same. 72% of resumes are never read by human eyes anymore. And so obviously who writes the code that operates in the systems that pass people's CVs and determine who gets through to the next round and who doesn't, plays a very important role in society in distributing one of the most valuable things that society has to offer, a job. And in terms of recognition, we all talk a lot about identity politics these days for obvious reasons. But in a world that's suffused with technology, it won't just be anomalous cases causing problems when we have voice recognition systems that don't hear the voices of women because they're going to be trained on male voices, or face recognition systems which can't see people of colour because they've only been trained on white faces. Or like the automated passport system in New Zealand, which rejected the application of a man in 2017 of Asian extraction on the basis that the photo he had submitted contained a photo of someone whose eyes were closed, is what the machine told him. So in the future, it won't just be humans who can offend and upset us. It'll be digital systems too. And again, I think that is an interesting change in human civilization, and one that we need to pay more attention to. Finally, democracy. I've no doubt that you've already, in your conference, gone through many of the ways in which democracy has been transformed by technology. Obviously, it transformed the relationship between the party and the individual. Almost all political organising takes place online. It's transformed the relationship between the individual and the state, e-petitions, online consultations. It's transformed the relationship between citizens and other citizens, allowing new and febrile forms of political organisation online, like the Arab Spring and Occupy. But in many ways, that stuff is all faster horses. It's also, of course, changed the way that we deliberate, and I won't go over that terrain because Franklin's eloquently talked already about how technology can polarize and fragment public discourse. But looking even further to the future, the three big challenges that I see to the way that we understand democracy are as follows. One is the challenge of direct democracy. For thousands of years, we've taken for granted that the only real functioning form of democracy in a large polity is parliamentary or representative democracy. In the future, I don't think that'll be the case. I think it'll be within our capacity, wanted to, for each of us to swipe left or to swipe right on a policy on any given day, or 5 times a day. Or if you didn't want to bother with that, to be able to delegate your vote as in a system of liquid democracy. So to say, on matters of healthcare, my vote can go into that consortium of doctors and nurses. And there are already stirrings in the populist nationalist movements around the world, people calling, as a matter of political philosophy, for more and more decisions to be taken on a direct democracy basis, like the Brexit referendum in the UK. And that is a debate that is going to intersect with technology, because tech is going to make it, in my mind, possible. The second big challenge is what I call data democracy. In a world where it's said that there's going to be 3 million books worth of data for every human being on the planet in relatively short order, it's surprising, at least in theory, to say that the system of government which best represents the people is one which represents them on the basis of a tick in the box every 3 or 4 years. I think there will be growing calls as a matter of philosophy and morality, not just as a matter of good public policy, but the big data that is so enjoyed by private sector firms to be used in the public sector too, as a matter of democratic legitimacy, to generate policies that actually it's not crazy to ask which aspects of public policy in the future might be better done by digital systems rather than by human beings. And again, it's a question that political philosophers have never had to deal with before. It's not a faster horses question. It's not like the question of king, priests, or democracy, or oligarchy, or plutarchy, whatever it was in the past. This is a new and potentially better form of government, but also potentially worse and more dangerous form too. So stepping back, when I think about the future of politics, I try to think not just about the immediate public policy problems that are thrown up today, difficult though they are. We need to understand, I think, that our generation is living through a period of colossal change in human civilization and how we organize ourselves as human beings. And every time in the past that we've gone through a big change in the way that we organize and disseminate information as a species, there's always been political upheavals that follow. Take one very simple example, the very first human empires spreading out over large amounts of terrain, followed in relatively short order after the invention of writing. Because it wasn't until we had that very powerful way of storing and communicating information that data could be kept in a permanent enough form, and a transportable enough form, in order to manage quality over a large distance. And so in the last century, in the 20th century, the big political question was what should be done by the market and what should be done by the state and what should be left to the market and civil society. And that was the question that divided right from left, and it divided the Eastern Hemisphere from the Western Hemisphere. I believe that our generation will have to tackle another question as well, perhaps even a more important one, which is this: to what extent should our lives be governed by powerful digital systems, whether publicly or privately held, and on what terms should our lives be governed by those systems? And until we start wrestling with that, not just as a public policy or even a legal or regulatory level, but at a deep philosophical and moral level too, until we start doing that hard intellectual legwork, we're not going to be in a position to make sound laws and to make sure that we live out this century in as prosperous and free a way as we would like to. Many thanks.
Anybody, you guys want to come up?
I can see on the video you're clapping.
We're going to see if we can bring Jamie into the discussion without feedback. You got to mute. Okay.
I have your phone muted.
Oh, that's this. That's picking up the sound. Oh. Okay, Lacey, I think maybe you just stay there. All right.
That's because I didn't mute on my microphone.
Ah, okay.
Oh, we have to give last time.
Yeah, he can hear, and then he can put the mic on.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm Linda Peak Schacht, and I have the pleasure of being here both in the capacity you see on the agenda, but also as the founding director of the Andrews Institute for Civic Leadership in Nashville, Tennessee. And I appreciate being able to moderate this amazing panel, all of whom have looked at the role of citizens in democracy from the lens of technology. One of the things that we've talked about is that we really are living not in a world where propaganda exists because of technology, but we're living in a world that is propaganda. And it's a world that was predicted by Jacques Ellul and by Marshall McLuhan decades ago, that we would eventually, because of technology, live in propaganda. Two of our panelists are relatively pessimistic. Jamie is the one that I think is more optimistic, as seen by the subtitle of his book, The Living Together in a World Transformed by Tech. the subtitles of the other authors that we'll get to, you'll see, are somewhat more negative. Frank, you talk about the existential threat.
What's so negative about that?
Well, it is a little bit less optimistic than Jamie. So, Jamie, I want to ask you, we're going to look at this through two lenses. First is the informed, engaged citizen, and what does it mean to be an informed, engaged citizen today? And the second is the effect for those citizens on the ability to deliberate in democracy. So, Jamie, I go to you. What's the next step for an individual citizen and for citizens collectively to move toward the kind of radical rethinking that you had?
Well, let's start with the word citizen. It's a very important word because I think that the way that most of us interact with technology is as consumers. A new technology comes out, we wonder whether we'll be able to buy it, how much it'll cost. Are you getting feedback?
It's kind of cool, though.
It's at moments like this that you don't feel like technology is imminently about to take over the world. Hold on, I'm going to turn down the volume of my own voice on this phone. All right, that should be a little bit better. So the first thing I would say is we need to think of ourselves as citizens rather than as consumers. And I think for too long we have done the opposite. I don't think it's just for us though, and I make that point with no qualms at all. I think the real important roles are going to be played by those who are in a position of political power and those who are in a position of power through their position in the tech industry. It is to me insane that you can become a software engineer or a computer scientist operating in these world-changing industries without a rigorous training in ethics and morality and the political consequences of your work. That should be as odd to us as the idea of a lawyer or a doctor who practices without that kind of training. And as for the politicians, we can call for regulation all we like, but in circumstances where we have a generation of politicians who are not as familiar with digital technology as they should be, and I think that the congressional hearings in recent months and years in the US can be held up as an example of that. My favorite one, I think, was a US senator holding up an iPhone to the head of Google and demanding an explanation as to how the product works. And Senator Mark asking Mark Zuckerberg how Facebook made money if it didn't charge its users. These are the guys who have actually done some thinking about technology. What about the rest of them? I think responsibility on those three groups. I think that, our shared future will, in the final analysis, be determined by whether we get politicians who are sufficiently literate with technology to make wise laws, software engineers who realize that they are, whether they like it or not, social engineers, and try to create a more diverse and more thoughtful working culture, and the rest of us who must see that the digital is political now, and that we have to treat technology not just as consumers, but as citizens, bringing the same skepticism, the same scrutiny, the same willingness to challenge authority that we've always brought to other forms of political authority, churches and states and foreigners and conquests and princes and priests in the past. Tech is the new form of power that we need to turn our gaze to, and if we don't, the changes will happen too fast for us to understand.
Thank you. Siva Vaidhyanathan is with us, and he has already raised his hand to respond. Eric and I talked about the fact that I'm only going to be a traffic cop here. So, Siva,
sure.
you
I
want to respond to what Jamie said.
I'm with Jamie on most of that. I need to resist this dismissal of citizens as regulators. Look, in 1787, we decided in this country that citizens will make our laws. We never expected them to master the intricacies of the catalytic converter, to master the intricacies of the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We never asked them to understand how carcinogens work. And yet, they regulate all those things. And they have for decades. They have for more than a century. That's not a standard we apply to any other part of our regulatory world. We don't ask them to be highway engineers when they appropriate funds and set standards for building highways. No, we have expertise built into our regulatory structures in this country through the executive branch, largely. We also rely on, and Congress relies on experts, relies on studies, relies on academics, relies on councils to provide the guidance toward any regulatory effort. So I have to dismiss this sneering at the notion that the people who actually sit in Congress must have some sort of level of expertise. And I must add that there are many members of Congress who actually do have that level of expertise, including my own senator, Mark Warner, who is a technology executive, right, made his millions running a technology company, and is leading the regulatory effort to push back at Facebook and Google.
Frank, you've interviewed Senator Warner fairly recently. What are you seeing there in Congress?
So I agree with Siva that if you were to go into a hearing on finance or air traffic control, they would perform at essentially the same level that they performed in that Facebook hearing. So Mark Warner published a white paper last summer outlining various solutions to the problem of big tech. And because he comes from the world of technology, he's been a few clicks more advanced in trying to think through the problem. And he presented a white paper that had a whole series of regulatory solutions, one of which would be to repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which would allow people to sue the big tech companies in state court and hold them responsible for the matter that's published on their platforms. He wanted to get some sort of U.S. version of the European privacy regulations, the GDPR. But I was struck, and he's very sophisticated and very good on these issues, but I was struck by one thing, which is that even the person who is most advanced in their thinking on these questions hasn't rallied around a single piece of legislation that they feel confident about bringing to the fore, that he's skeptical of antitrust as a solution, and so that ultimately the big policy debate will be between people who feel comfortable with the power of these companies but feel like they needed to be constrained by certain rules of the road, and that becomes the focus of the debate, or a solution that focuses on breaking the companies up. Now, there's nothing inherently mutually exclusive, but in terms of thinking, this is the classic debate in American political economy between the Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Crowley, Louis Brandeis. It was the debate within the New Deal itself. Like, what type of economic structure do we want to live with?
Yeah,
Julie.
first of all, I think I'm going to be the optimist. And I'm probably even going to go a little
First,
farther
tell
because I
us
feel like
what-
someone's got to.
Tell us what tech
Tech New